Can I ask Professor Madge to...
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you for attending. Well, I was just at the British Museum the other day at the Viking exhibition, and of course the Vikings slave traded in Bristol in the year 1000, so it's not completely irrelevant. But what struck me is that in one of the cases they had a medal of the great Norse god Odin, and on his shoulder were two ravens, Thuman and Mumin, the ravens of history and memory. So you had history on one side of the shoulder and memory on the other. And I thought that's a rather telling metaphor, because memory, the raven who was symbolizing memory, it comes from a Norse word which either means memory or desire. And I think history and memory are two different things. And if we take a sort of Rankian, old-fashioned view, that history is what happened in the past, and I know that's contested, but for the purposes for tonight, let's just say that what we can document and understand actually occurred, as opposed to what we choose to remember. I think that we're getting into the territory about what sort of legacy we want to establish, or what sort of history, official history and civic commemoration we want to establish for this city. And who's the we? Who is the we that has a collective memory of our city's history? I think the public has changed over the period, and it's riven. It's not a monolithic public. It's riven by class, race, gender divisions. And the history of slavery in this city has often been contested. When I first came here in the 70s, I was absolutely astonished at the fact that people would use the term darky is a casual term of talking about black people. It's something that was in the 19th century in the Civil War in America, and that a lot of people did not want to talk about slavery. And I feel somewhat responsible for the current controversy over Colston, because when I worked with on the first slavery exhibition in 1998, I did an outreach exercise in St. Paul's and talked about the research I'd done that really clinched the involvement of Colston in the Royal African Company. This was something that had been, in the academic literature in the 1920s, but pretty much ignored and certainly denied by Bristol's establishment. Well, the next day after this public meeting, the Colston statue was then daubed in red with F. Hoff, slave trader. And it just shows you the volatility and the fact that, history isn't just an academic subject. It actually means something about the way we articulate the kind of present in which we want to live. And so with that comes responsibility, because what kind of history do you want to convey? The kind of accuracy and the good research that you put into the history will inform and determine the quality of the kind of commemoration you have. And I think it's really important that we embrace the contradictory aspects of our history. The fact, for example, that Colston was a director of the Royal African Company, did trade in slave-produced sugar, did co-invest in the sugar refinery, which is where St. Peter's Church is. But he also was a philanthropist of a very selective kind. You had to be Church of England and a Tory to get the fruits of his charity. But he was he helped renovate the city. And so as such is celebrated uncritically by another section of establishment society. And we have to look at those connections and embrace the contradictions, because we are a contradictory, as human beings, we are contradictory. And I think it's really interesting to ask, how could somebody who had all these charitable and religious impulses also justify the enslavement of other human beings, and not to silence one aspect of their existence at the expense of the other. And so although I can see the justice of renaming Colston Hall because it is a music venue, I'm very uneasy about airbrushing the Colston's name or getting rid of the statue of Colston, because that erases the history, so that when people come, they may have a corporate, bland notion of the history and perhaps a nod in the direction that, oh yes, it was a slave trading port, but they won't see the layers upon layers of the influence of the slave trade on the city's history. So somehow we have to negotiate a way that doesn't do a disservice or doesn't denigrate the fact that our public now is comprised of a lot of different people, including the descendants of enslaved Africans, and we must not honor someone who has exploited them. On the other hand, we must not erase the historical nuances and contradictions from our collective memory, and so I feel quite strongly about that. Now, I think there's some really interesting responses that you get about the legacy of slavery, because many people, either with regard to the Colston debate or the statue or what have you, many mainly white working class people and middle class people are saying is, oh, well, slavery was a long time ago, get over it. In fact, that was the very word of someone who emailed me congratulating me on my position of my debate, which made me think, oh dear, that wasn't quite the response I had wanted to elicit. And in response to that kind of a statement, I would say that the legacy of slavery is a lot more long-standing and long-lasting than a lot of people, particularly white people, realize. There's a legacy of economic underdevelopment that was encapsulated in a 1938 report about Jamaica, Royal Commission. There was a lot of labor unrest in Jamaica just before the first generation, the Windrush generation, came out to Britain. And one of the things that they found, in fact, they had to suppress the Royal Commission findings till after the war, it was so explosive, was that the agricultural workers in 1938 were earning the same in real terms as those agricultural workers who had just been emancipated in 1838. Okay? So really, people haven't moved on in terms of earning power since slavery. There was very little infrastructure in terms of roads, industrial development, schools, and certainly no colleges in the late 1930s. That's the generation that came over. So there's a continuing legacy of underdevelopment. We could also ask about the kind of warlord culture that the slave trade helped to foment and strengthen in West Africa, whether that has a legacy about governance in this city as well. Governance in Africa as well. And also is at the root, perhaps with colonialization that followed slavery, that helped to determine the kind of population which has a growing West African presence in this city and in Britain as a whole. There's a psychological legacy, which I think many white people are insensitive to, of not knowing your identity, of the trauma of slavery, of not being able to trace your ancestors beyond enslavement, which leaves a lot of people a bit rootless and not knowing where they sort of fit in to sort of the cosmos in which they inhabit. And I think that hurt and that trauma needs to be properly honored. I also think that political correctness does have its faults, because if you simply try to enforce a politically correct view on the city's history without taking people along through education, you can cause white resentment, and we've seen that with the UKIP reaction, where particularly working class people feel their exploitation hasn't been recognized, that middle class museum curators from London feel much more comfortable dealing with ethnic issues than class issues. And I think that although white working class exploitation is very different in terms of brutalization and intensity than enslavement, it still needs to be recognized in this city. And I think the work of the Bristol Radical History Group has done some great stuff on that. In terms of, I'm probably running out of time, so I'll leave it with that, but I hope I've given you a bit of food for thought. Thank you.